Hey, this is Alan from Launch Tabletop. First things first, the discussion is about drift and bleed when it comes to card frames, especially around the edges of it. And in this particular example, and I'm not exactly sure which game this is, I think it's Call of Cthulhu or Cthulhu card game, something in that sort of vein. It's done by Fantasy Flight Games. Yeah. In this particular case, the inquiry is about the fact that how is it possible that a game like this, the way that it's designed, have elements that are so close to the edge? Isn't this technically something that you want to avoid? And if it's not something that you avoid, how is it possible for a manufacturer to be able to provide accuracy in their cutting to the level where it's tolerable for this particular project? So I wanted to walk through some of the elements here and highlight some things. So just to quickly explain what I have, I'm using Illustrator as my software of choice, but everything that I talk about here is generally applicable to any graphic design software or anything else. I'm just using this as a way to illustrate. So a couple of things is what I've prepared. First and foremost, this is just the exact image that was supplied. And all I've done quickly is just I've made sure that I've made it 63 mils wide. What I illustrate here isn't really size dependent. This can apply to poker, bridge sized, tarot, whatever it is. It all based around the same kind of philosophy. But the next thing that you want to measure obviously is the bleed area. So the bleed here in this instance is, so I'll just quickly move that down so it's visible. I'll just move everything down. Okay, so basically you have 3 mil bleed on either side, and you want to do that for the height area as well. So you want, essentially, if this is your final art, then you want to go 3 mils out and 3 mils in for margin. I'll talk about margin in a bit. So why this black border? Because I don't actually have access to the original artwork. The original one will have the artwork extend past into this black zone area. So you're just going to have to use your imagination, and this is important to illustrate in an idea in a bit, but imagine that this card frame graphical element here extends past this area here, and that there will be more parchment here, as well as having this a symbol fully enclosed with its shadow applied onto the parchment there, as well as this area here extending past. So you're going to have to imagine what that looks like, as well as this artwork will have the buildings that extend past this way and this way as well. Okay, so we have our card, our imaginary sort of bleed portion, which is really just a larger extension of this entire card. We have the margin here, and now we are ready to talk about drift. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to pretend that this is really a single object, because this is really just one piece of artwork. And what I've done also is, I prepared one earlier. This is essentially the cutting area, the cut line. I have it in a solid color because I'm actually using Illustrator I'm going to using this object essentially as a visual mask to mask the artwork as if it's been cut out and what it'll look like. So if I use Command 7 or Control 7 on Windows, then I can mask this element. And what you see here, I'm just going to center this. What you see here is essentially the cutout area. It's like a very roundabout way of doing exactly what the image already is, which is I've extended the black border and then cut it back in. Nothing's really changed, except now I can show you exactly what it looks like when drift happens. So first things first, in Illustrator, I have the ability to change my keyboard increments when I'm using my arrow keys. So I can show you what it will look like if I just move the image to simulate what drift looks like. So what I do is I press A for direct selection. I select the artwork to simulate a cutting drift. So if you will, that's drifted up and to the right, basically. Now to simulate that in my case, I actually have to go down and to the left, I believe, right? No, like that, yeah. So you imagine that it's just moved up to the right in this case. So it's down to the right in my case. And then it's stamped it. And now you've got this drift. So this is a 1 mil drift. Now note that every manufacturer have different sort of tolerances. 5 is it can be standard. Some have 2 mil drifts. I know that if you're using more like a a local print shop kind of situation, then their drift tolerance could be up to 2 mils. And for sort of mass production for these, it could be 1.5 down to 1 mil. Rarely you would see anything less than 1 mil. If it is, then I'll explain how they achieve that in a bit. But notice here that even within a 1 mil drift, notice that I've just went 1 mil to the left and 1 mil up. In this case, it's quite substantial, right? So why is it substantial visually when it's, if you think about it in millimeter terms, 1 mil is that much? It's actually a compounding effect. So if you think about the idea of how much has been drifted, so this line here is 1 mil, as you can see here. That's a 1 millimeter drift this way, right? The compounding effect is the fact that actually the arrows depends on your perspective, but let's talk about it from the perspective of the artwork. The artwork actually has drifted this way, and not only that, but that also there's a mil drift this way, and it actually has a kind of a collectively a 2 mil effect, if you will, because you're now seeing a mil worth of visual element that is not supposed to be seen, and then you've got there another mil that's been cut away. And this happens both axes, x-axis and y-axis. So it has a pretty significant effect, even at a 1 mil tolerance. And that is good industry standard at 1 mil, I think is actually really good. So let's see what it might look like if my tolerance is in the majority of the situations, say 0.5 mils. 5 mils still has a cumulative effect of 1 mil total displacement, if you will, in both axes. So in this instance, it still is scary, because if you think about important text that sits below the margin line, that likely will get cut off. What does it look like if, it looks like if it's like 1 mil up and 0.5 mil across, then your title is going to get cut off. So be aware basically that drift is something that has a compounding effect, and it has little drifts have big impact on your artwork. Second thing I want to talk about is margin. So here's the margin line. Margin line is always 3 mils inset. You have 3 mil outset, 3 mil inset, 3 mil outset for the bleed, 3 mil inset for the margin. That's pretty typical. What is a margin? Why is margin important? Margin is there to make sure that anything that is critical is maintained within the margin safety zones. Typically, we would think critical information are things like text. Text is really important that you be able to read them. In this case, this is inside of the margin zones. This symbol sits outside, the title sits outside, and the attribution text sits outside. So you might then wonder, how is it that they're able to break the rules in this case? Margin line is not technically a hard and fast rule. It's industry standard sort of good practice. And that because you already are thinking about it in terms of bleed, and if you know what your manufacturer's drift tolerances are, then you can basically ensure that if my text is within the drift amount, then it's really not going to get cut off. You then ask, why is margin important? Margin is important in a couple of things, but this is more of a graphic design good practice, more so than in terms of manufacturing. But in terms of graphic design, you want everything to sit inside of 3 mil margin, like having margins in printed paper, or when you're writing, you want to have a certain amount of margins. Where that actually does come into effect in manufacturing is if you keep everything within a certain industry standard good practice, then your design is going to be manufacturer agnostic, in the sense that, say that you're using a local print shop or your own printer, or you're using print-on-demand services that have much higher tolerance error bars, then having your text within that 3 mil area is going to be very safe, basically. The next thing is, what are some of the clever things that this game has done to actually solve the visual impact of drift? And there are some clever things that they've done. So I want to point out that when you're thinking about graphic design and the edge area of your card frame, there's really two ways that you can do this. You either do bordered or non-bordered. In this instance, say that you don't want to go with a bordered look. And personally, I don't like the bordered look. A lot of the games that I've published in the past as a publisher were games that didn't have borders. And this is one good example. So how do you make a design so that it doesn't have that, oh, this is obviously misaligned? In graphic design, you want to make sure that your card frame extension provides visual continuity. So I quickly illustrate what that means in this instance is you want to just quickly imagine this card frame. I've illustrated one here, and then there's another card frame here. Now, it doesn't have to be, in this particular design, it's obviously an ellipse, but it doesn't have to be. As long as there is this visual continuity, and by that I mean the card frame extends all the way across, the parchment will actually come across, everything is actually just a continuous design. And the reason why this continuity helps with hiding drift is that if the card is actually cut slightly off center, you're not going to be able to tell where the end of this artwork exists, right? Because it's just cut off at midpoint, somewhere in this continuity of visual design. So I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching.